December 16, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At 5:30 in the morning, under heavy fog and falling snow, German artillery opened fire along a quiet stretch of the Western Front. For weeks, American units had considered this sector unsuitable for a major offensive. The dense forests, narrow roads, and brutal winter weather made large-scale maneuver warfare almost impossible. That assumption was exactly what Adolf Hitler was counting on. The attack was part of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Germany's last strategic gamble in the West. At its core stood SS General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, tasked with punching through the American lines, crossing the Meuse River, and splitting the Allied forces in half. Speed was everything, surprise was essential, and above all, Dietrich believed the weather would be his greatest ally. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow muffled sound. Visibility dropped to meters. German commanders were convinced that American artillery, so dependent on observation and coordination, would be ineffective. Infantry dug into foxholes believed they were relatively safe. The forest, they thought, would absorb the explosions. The ground would swallow the shells. They were wrong. What Dietrich and his officers could not see, what no reconnaissance patrol could detect, was not waiting in the Ardennes at all. It was waiting in the United States, thousands of miles away, in laboratories where the war was fought with slide rules instead of rifles. Back in 1940, after the fall of France, American scientists had been given an unusual mandate. The newly formed Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, led by Vannevar Bush, was tasked with one mission: solve military problems that traditional doctrine could not. Among those problems was artillery effectiveness. World War I had already shown a brutal truth. Artillery caused the majority of casualties, but only when conditions were right. Snow, mud, forests, and soft ground dramatically reduced lethality. Shells buried themselves before detonating. Shrapnel flew sideways instead of downward. Infantry survived by digging deeper. At the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland, physicists like Ralph B. Baldwin began working on an idea that sounded almost impossible for the 1940s. A shell that could sense the ground beneath it, not through impact, not through time delay, but through radio waves. The concept was radical. A miniature radio transmitter would be placed inside an artillery shell. As the shell descended, the signal would bounce off the ground and return. When the reflected signal changed frequency, a phenomenon known as the Doppler effect, the fuse would trigger an explosion at precisely the most lethal height above the target. The problem was size. Vacuum tubes were fragile. Acceleration forces inside artillery shells exceeded 20,000 G. No electronic device had ever survived such conditions. Yet by 1943, after thousands of failed tests, the impossible began to work. The project was codenamed T132, later known simply as the VT Fuse. Variable time, a deliberately misleading name meant to conceal its true nature. American leadership feared capture. If Germany recovered an unexploded shell, the technological advantage could vanish overnight. As a result, the weapon was tightly controlled. Even senior commanders often didn't know what made it different. General George S. Patton would later refer to it cryptically in his diary as the funny fuse. By December 1944, with the Ardennes offensive threatening to overwhelm American lines, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized its use on the Western Front. The order was brief. The implications were enormous. When German infantry and armored units of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, advanced through the forest toward positions like Elsenborn Ridge, they encountered what appeared to be ordinary artillery fire. There was no immediate reason to panic. The shells didn't hit the ground. They didn't need to. Above the snow-covered treetops, the sky itself became the killing zone, and the soldiers below had no idea why. The first salvos detonated above the German lines. At first, officers of the 12th SS Panzer Division assumed the Americans had miscalculated their range. Artillery shells bursting in midair were usually a sign of faulty fuses or premature detonation, an annoyance, not a threat. But within seconds, the forest floor began to tell a different story. Steel fragments rained down vertically, not horizontally. Foxholes, carefully dug for protection against ground bursts, became traps. Snow, instead of absorbing the blast, reflected shrapnel inward. Men pressed against frozen earth found that there was nowhere to hide from explosions coming from above. American forward observers, operating from concealed positions near Elsenborn Ridge, noticed something remarkable. German infantry was no longer advancing in organized formations. Units stalled, columns dissolved. Survivors ran, not forward, not backward, but sideways, instinctively trying to escape a threat they could not see. Behind the lines, U.S. artillery crews worked with mechanical calm. Batteries of the V Corps fired pre-calculated barrages using firing data refined over years of training. The shells did not require perfect accuracy. They only needed to pass close enough. The VT Fuze did the rest. Unlike traditional impact fuses, which required solid contact with the ground, the VT Fuze detonated at an altitude of approximately 20 to 30 feet, the ideal height to maximize lethal dispersion. Each shell effectively transformed into an aerial mine. One round could incapacitate dozens of exposed soldiers. German after-action reports would later describe the effect as unnatural. Survivors spoke of explosions that hung in the air and fragments that fell like steel rain. Some units believed they were under attack by a new form of airburst bomb. Others suspected gas, until they saw the wounds. By December 18th, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever American artillery employed the new fuse, German momentum collapsed. Attacks stalled not because of lack of courage, but because cohesion disintegrated. Commanders could not move units forward when every open space became lethal. Sepp Dietrich's plan depended on speed. His armored spearheads, King Tiger tanks and Panzer IVs, required infantry support to clear American positions. Without it, tanks advanced blindly into ambushes or halted altogether. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. A stalled tank burned fuel without moving. A stopped offensive burned time Germany did not have. Meanwhile, American commanders began to understand what they had been given. General George S. Patton, racing his Third Army northward after pivoting from Lorraine, noted the dramatic shift in artillery effectiveness. In his diary, he wrote of enemy infantry being cut to pieces by airbursts, calling the new fuse one of the war's greatest inventions. But the weapon's true power lay not just in physics, it lay in integration. The U.S. Army had built its artillery doctrine around communication. Forward observers, radios, fire direction centers, and massed batteries worked as a single system. The VT Fuze amplified that system exponentially. Where once artillery suppressed, it now annihilated. German doctrine had no immediate counter. Their artillery relied heavily on visual spotting and pre-registered fire. Electronic countermeasures were non-existent. There was no way to jam a shell already falling from the sky. By December 23rd, as the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the air, the fate of the offensive was already sealed on the ground. The German advance had lost its rhythm. Units meant to break through were now struggling to survive. What had begun as Hitler's bold winter gamble was turning into a slow-motion disaster, not because American soldiers fought harder, but because American science had changed the rules of the battlefield in ways the Wehrmacht had never anticipated. And still, the Germans did not fully understand why they were dying in such numbers. That realization would come too late. By the last week of December 1944, German commanders were no longer asking how to break through the American lines. They were asking how to survive them. Captured reports from the 6th SS Panzer Army revealed growing confusion. Units reported heavy casualties without direct contact. Officers described artillery fire that required no correction, shells that detonated with unnatural precision. The forest, once seen as protection, had become a killing ground. At Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery units maintained continuous fire for days. The 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, heavily outnumbered, held their positions not through counterattacks, but through controlled destruction. Every German attempt to mass troops for an assault ended the same way. Airbursts above treetops, steel fragments slicing downward, command structures erased in seconds. For the 12th SS Panzer Division, composed largely of young, ideologically driven soldiers, the psychological effect was devastating. Veterans later recalled that courage no longer mattered. Discipline no longer mattered. You could not charge an enemy you could not see, and you could not take cover from the sky itself. German artillery attempted counter-battery fire, but it was ineffective. American guns displaced frequently, guided by superior communication networks. Even when German shells landed accurately, they lacked the same lethality in snow-covered terrain. By January 1945, attrition told the final story. In some SS units, effective strength dropped by nearly 50%. Tanks abandoned due to fuel shortages littered forest roads. The offensive that was meant to reach Antwerp failed to cross even half the planned distance. In post-war interrogations, German officers admitted what had gone wrong. They had prepared for American numbers, American air power, American industry. What they had not prepared for was American innovation under pressure. The VT Fuze was not a miracle weapon by itself. It did not win the Battle of the Bulge alone. But it represented something deeper, something the German war effort could no longer match. The United States did not just produce more weapons. It produced better systems, faster solutions, and the ability to turn scientific theory into battlefield reality within months, not years. As James Finney Baxter III would later write in Scientists Against Time, the war was increasingly decided not only by generals, but by engineers, physicists, and industrial planners working far from the front lines. The Ardennes proved a final lesson. The German army still fought with courage, discipline, and experience, but those qualities belonged to the 19th century. The Americans were fighting with 20th century physics, and once the weather cleared, once Allied aircraft returned to the skies, there was no longer any illusion left. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with silence, broken only by abandoned equipment and the realization that the technological gap could never be closed. The war in the West would continue for 4 more months, but its outcome had already been decided.